intermodal transport and supply chain logistics. And that this was intentionally like obtuse of a topic because it is actually really friggin' cool. So if all goes well, then at the end of this talk, you will be as excited about supply chain logistics as I am. And how ridiculous and efficient the whole global economy is. So we're gonna start it off with a toy. So I went to Target and I got this toy. And actually I got two of them. Two. One of them is to take apart, and the other one is in case I couldn't reassemble it, but it did, so cool, now I got two. This toy is $19.99 MSRP, but I picked it up for $9.99. It is officially licensed Fast and Furious, so Vin Diesel's making some money off of this, I don't know how much. It comes with batteries, and it was made in China, which means it had to get all the way over here so that I could buy it. And this is going to be a Christmas present for an 8-year-old boy. So this talk is going to be the origin story of this toy and how it will make me the hero of Christmas. All right, so the story of this toy starts roughly a year ago when a bunch of engineers started designing it. And then other people started working on the logistics of how this thing is going to be manufactured and shipped and tested. They had to not only design the thing, but they had to design all of the tools that were used to make the thing. And we had to do testing like FCC, maybe UL, drop testing, just all kinds of maybe user testing to make sure that the manual was easy to read, that all the translations turned out okay. It takes a long time to make a product like this, and somehow they were able to do it in under a year. And I know that it was under a year. I'll get there. So this is the toy. Actually, I can take it apart. And okay. Yeah, lights up. Goes forwards and backwards, and turns left and right, and it lights up. So cool. And here's the exploded view. No, I'm kidding. I did disassemble it though, just so that we can take a look at what's inside. So actually, all of these aren't the smallest pieces. These are all sub-assemblies. So we've got the plastic body, which is actually composed of 3 plastic parts and then a whole bunch of painting steps. There's the underside, which has a whole bunch of plastics. There is the circuit board, and then there's a bunch of screws. And if we look in detail at the circuit board, so we've got, there's the antenna, and then we've got some H bridges, which do the left and right, forward and back. We've got the battery, and there's a misspelling way up there where it says GDN, that should be ground. Yeah, but anyway, so you remember hearing about the supply chain problems we had with electronics? Well, the reason for that is because when the pandemic hit, this demand continued, but the production of all of these electronics parts stopped. And so for a while we were fine because we had all this buffer of already manufactured electronics components, but eventually that buffer ran out and the demand didn't. And so we got stuck where everyone needed a lot of these components and they weren't available. And you can't sell your part if you don't have all the parts. So it actually got even worse because then companies would order multiple orders of the same part from different companies, hoping that at least one of them would be able to deliver. So the demand was artificially high. We're only now just starting to get out of it, but I do electronics as a day job, and I'm still dealing with parts that have a 99-week lead time. Yeah, it's tough. Okay, now let's look at the controller part. So this is kind of the same thing where we've got a whole bunch of plastic parts and a whole bunch of screws and some metal springs and other stuff. And actually, this thing even came with AA batteries, so it was like a perfect stocking stuffer. I'm not trying to sell it to you, but it's pretty cool. So this is the circuit board, and the thing to note, there are two things to note about this. So one of them is all of those wires were hand soldered by a person. And the other thing is there is a date on here of February 2022, which is probably when the most recent revision of this PCB the design was complete. This is a recent thing. And this is the back side of the board, or the front, whichever. The thing to note about this is that it is revision 4. So that's actually pretty normal for a circuit board or for any of the parts really to go through numerous revisions as they reduce the component count, refine the design so that it can be more manufacturable, make it easier to assemble, they make improvements before it's finally ready to ship. Okay, so here's everything laid out. All of the parts. I took it all apart and spread it all out, and they're all unique, specific to this particular toy. There are roughly 84 parts, and that's not including all of the pieces that are on the circuit board. And so each one of these pieces had to have been designed and manufactured, so they had to have a tool to do this, to make this specific part. And then all of those parts have to be manufactured in different factories. You're not going to have one factory that makes the cardboard and the plastic parts. So all these parts have to come from various factories, from raw materials that come from various places around the world, and eventually make it back to the contract manufacturer where they can assemble it. So this is another view of that breakdown, where we're looking at how all of these things come together. So I'm not going to go through all 84 parts, but I'll talk about some of the generic bits. So we'll start with oil, because plastic is a petroleum product. And that means that all of the plastics have to come from oil, which comes from various parts of the world. So if you look at the United States, we make 19 million barrels of oil a day, but we consume 19 million, so we're roughly equal. Great, go for us. But then if you look at China makes 5 million barrels a day, but they consume 15 million barrels a day. They've got to make up for that somehow. And it turns out Russia has an excess of 10 million barrels a day. This is why China is kind of wishy-washy about Russia invading Ukraine, because China relies on Russia's oil for its entire economy. Okay, iron ore though is all from Australia. That's fine. No political problems there. And then rare earths, so the neodymium that's in the magnets. China makes a lot of that, but it turns out the United States also makes a significant amount too. So it's quite possible that the magnets that are in this toy came from the United States, went to China, were put into this toy, and then came back to the United States. Okay, here's another view of this, because I really want this to sink in. There are a lot of parts that come on this toy, and all these parts come from around the world. Some African mines are responsible for tantalum, which is in capacitors. We have to be careful when designing our products that we're not using tantalum that comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, because those smelters are run by, it's involved in the civil war in Congo. It's so far removed from thinking about this toy, but it's something that the engineers and the supply chain logistics people have to think about all the time. Okay, so eventually all these parts get put together into our toy. Yay. Now I've got this toy, and it is sitting in a factory in China. Whoa, how's it gonna get to me? They could just ship individually in every box, but that's horribly inefficient. They're gonna put it into a corrugated cardboard box. So cardboard boxes come in a variety of types, but there are two things that you should know about them. And it's the flutes and the walls. So there are different flute types, and that's how wavy it is, like the thickness and the density of the waves. And then there's also multiple walls. And you can have combinations of flutes and multiple walls, so that one wall has like a C flute and an A flute. It gets complicated. But one of the neat things is that you can look on the bottom of any box, and there's this standard stamp that shows you where the box was made and how much it's rated for like crush weight. It's kind of neat. And we're actually pretty decent, like environmentally, when it comes to cardboard. So in the last 50 years, we have doubled the amount of cardboard that we consume, but we have halved the amount that goes to the landfills. Pretty neat. Okay, so we've got our toy in a box, and a whole bunch of boxes, and they're still in China. What do we do about that? Next, we introduce the pallet. So the pallets are standardized, but just like any standard, there's a whole bunch of them. And we have, basically, pallets are designed to carry a whole bunch of things, either by pallet jack or by forklift, and support the weight of those things as they're being transferred. But they're also kind of gross. So like, they've been on grounds around the world, and they've had all kinds of fungicides and spills and weird things on them. So please, do not make any artisanal, bespoke cutting boards out of them. They're gross. Okay, now we have our toy in a box on a pallet in a loading dock in China still. So how do we get it to me? This is the important thing, it's all about me. And this is where we start talking about what's called Incoterms. Target doesn't own any ships. They don't own any means to get the toys from the manufacturer to me, or to their stores. And they're in a different language too. It's China and the United States, and they're dealing with, and the people in China are dealing with their suppliers in Australia. And so we've got all of these organizations around the world communicating with each other, but trying to use the same language and dealing with these really large volumes of money. And so we have Incoterms, which talks about who is doing what, who is responsible for what, and where the risk is, and when that risk is transferred for like insurance purposes. So when you and I are purchasing something off the internet, we assume that the other party will take care of the shipping and get it to us, and the responsibility and risk transfers at our doorstep. But when you're dealing with China or any other large manufacturer, they don't want to deal with that. They don't want to have to do anything more than just leave it at their loading dock and let you take care of the rest. And so that's when you hire like a freight forwarding company who will take care of all that logistics for you. And I have experience with this. So I did this once when I ordered 1,000 collapsible laundry hammers from China. And why I did this is a completely different story. It's fun, but it's not for tonight. But they came from China. I had to pay for the pallet. I didn't realize that was an expense that I would have to consider, but I own a pallet now. So there was it made it all the way to Chicago, and there was a snafu, and I ended up having to rent a U-Haul and drive down to the warehouse and carry them home. It was an experience, a learning experience. Okay, so if your product is light and really expensive, and you're in a hurry, then you might have it shipped by air. Yeah, air freight is really expensive though. But it's fast, like 2 or 3 days. So you can rely on FedEx and UPS and DHL. They'll get you your cargo, but at a price. But you can also end up using like Lufthansa, United, Delta. They all have the ability to transport your cargo in their holds on passenger airplanes as well. But the vast majority of containers goods are transported via the container. So this thing is the workhorse of intermodal transport. They are steel, they have a door at one end, and they are very strong because they have to support not just the weight of that's inside, but also stacking these things many high. They also have vents because they're designed to sink in case they fall off a ship. And you want them to sink because you don't want a big metal berg floating around and sinking other ships. So containers are always 8 feet wide. They are either 8.5 or 9.5 feet tall, and they are usually 40 feet deep. Although there are variants that are 20 feet, and then in the United States, we also have ones that are 45, 48, and 53 feet long. Who knows why? It's the US. Yeah, and they all have the support structures at 40 feet or 20 feet. So these support structures are where the container is held to either another container or to the ship or semi or whatever. So remember these corners because they will be important later. And this is what the inside looks like. And I've put one of my little RC cars there for scale. The bottom is wood and the sides are metal. Not very exciting. But this is what it looks like when it's full. So we've got a pallet with a whole bunch of boxes, and the pallet is wrapped in plastic because you don't want any of the boxes falling off while they're on a forklift. And then to fill up any extra space in the container, we've got these dunnage bags, which is basically like industrial packing peanuts or the bubble wrap. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, that's
Okay, and then this is called a reefer, and it is not a hot box, it is a cold box. It's a refrigerated unit. It's got its own internal power supply, but when it's on things like a semi or a ship, then it will be hooked up to that external power. So this is how we get frozen or refrigerated things from foreign countries to the United States while maintaining what's called the cold chain. Okay, back to our cars. So we've got boxes, toys in boxes on pallets wrapped in plastic on a loading dock, soon to be a container, and next it goes onto a ship. So this is called a row-row, or roll-on, roll-off. And our cars are too small. This is just a picture that I made. It's basically like a giant ferry. This is a dry bulk container, dry bulk ship, and it's for like grains and ores, and yeah, other dry stuff. But the crazy thing about dry goods is that when you vibrate them, they can act like a liquid. So if you've got like a ship that is being rocked by waves at a consistent rate, then that dry good will actually like flow, and it can flow to the side and tip a ship over. So each of these bulk like bins has vertical bulkheads that go forward and side to side, and they prevent sloshing from happening. Okay, but our RC cars are going to be on a container ship. So these things are gigantic, like 400 yards long, and they have a draft of like 60 feet. That means that they are 60 feet under the water. And they can carry 24,000 TEUs. So a TEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit, which is their standard way of describing stuff. But that means that it's the equivalent of 12,000 semi-trucks carrying containers in one ship. Wow. Yeah, let that sink in. But don't let the ship sink. And these things cross the Pacific Ocean in 3 weeks. And it's roughly 3 weeks because that actually changes based on the price of shipping at the time. So if shipping is really expensive, then they will go as fast as they can, like balls to the wall. Let's get these containers over to the other side so we can turn around and do another load. But if shipping is really cheap, then there's no hurry. They will save on gas and go slower, and that reduces the global supply, like dynamically, almost in real time, of how all the pricing works. It's crazy. So here's a picture of what the global shipping looks like. And I wanted to point out what happens, wow, the United That did not come out well. Okay, so it's North America on the left, Europe is in the middle, and Asia is on the right. And what you can see in the middle is all of that traffic that goes from Asia to Europe is going through the Suez Canal. So you remember when the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal? Yeah, that caused everything going into Europe to get stuck. This is a big deal. Here's another pretty picture that actually turned out better, so that's nice. But you can see how much traffic is going through the Suez Canal, but then you also have some ships that are too big for the Suez Canal, mostly like oil ships that go around the south of Africa. And this is a picture of Saturday afternoon-ish when I went to a website that tracks all of the commercial traffic. So every ship has to have a transponder on it so that you know where all of the ships are. And this is important because some of these ships have stopping distance of 3 or 4 miles. So you need to be able to know if you're going to hit another ship. So once our ship arrives at a port, this is where it ends up. This is a typical port. You've got the ship has lined up on the dock. There are a whole bunch of cranes that are lined up with each tracks where all of the containers, it's like a temporary storage. And you've got some semis that are, why am I even pointing? It doesn't do any good. So there's some semis that are unloading from the crane to the stacks. And then there's these things called strads, which also move containers around. And I'll get into that soon. So this is a better view of the cranes that are lining up with each row of the ship. And the semi for scale is way down there. Okay, so each of these ships is packed according to this loading plan that is really complicated because they have to take into account things like whether it's a hazardous material inside and then you want to keep it away from the crew part of the ship, or whether it's a reefer and it needs to be powered, or if it's heavy, then it needs to be on the bottom to keep the center of gravity low. And when it's being unloaded, because these ships are making multiple ports of call, and so you want to be able to unload the container at the right time without having to dig a whole bunch of containers out first that are on top. And there's one dude, or person, who is in each of these cranes. And they have an extremely stressful job because they're expected to maintain roughly 20 to 40 container moves per hour. So that is grabbing the correct container according to the plan that is laid out for them, picking it up, bringing it, dropping it off, and then going back for the next one, or loading it the other way around. So they end up making like over $200,000 a year. So if you want to like invest in your future, you should definitely practice a lot on those claw machines. Okay, remember the cornered things that I was pointing out on the container? This is another star of the show. This is the twist lock. And what it does is it connects the two containers to each other, or there will also be twist locks that are connecting the container to the ship or to the semi or whatever. And so you'll have longshoremen who run around during this loading and unloading on the ship, and they're removing or adding the twist locks to all of these containers and doing all of the lashings. It's a very busy job, and these guys are union workers and they earn it. Okay, so off the ship, I mentioned the straddle carriers. These things will drive over the container, pick it up, and then drive it to another location, which is either like the stacks for temporary storage, or drop it onto a semi-truck. And in some cases, the port is next to a railway, and so the strads will drop the container directly onto the rail car, and then it's off to the races. Okay, so we've got our toy in a box on a pallet, wrapped in plastic, in a container on a train, and they've got lots of containers on them. Most of them are coming from either LA or Seattle, Tacoma. Those are the biggest ports in the US because they're on the Pacific Ocean side. And our cars end up in Chicago. I'll zoom in a little bit. There we go. And they end up at this rail yard. And you can see the rail yard is the vertical lines. And right next to it to the right is the stacks for temporary storage. But then you can also see on the other side of this canal, there's a big vertical box. That is the target flow center. So what happens is the train arrives at this rail yard and the containers get unloaded, probably directly onto trucks, where they take that one road that goes straight across to the target flow center, which is basically like a distribution center. So this is a picture of a generic distribution center. And what's happening inside is the loading docks are on the left, and the container will arrive on a semi and get unloaded, and then all of those pallets and boxes are broken apart and reshuffled around the distribution center. And then in a different loading dock, what they will do is they will set up all of the things that are going to a specific target. So this one setup will have not just my toys, but also like diapers and clothes and all these things that came from other containers. So now all of this is set up for this one loading dock at the distribution center, going to a specific target. And it gets there via a semi-truck. And you guys have all seen these. You know what they look like. This one does not have a container. It's got, it is not ready for intermodal transport. This is only going to be traveling within the continental US, basically. One useful thing with these semis is that if you are on the road with them and you see one that is like there's nobody in front of the semi, and you get their attention and you do this, they will usually oblige and honk for you. Also, you can flash them, but I have had mixed results with that. Okay, we're almost done. So we end up at Target, and this is their back room, and things are unloaded into the back room where they are stored until they're ready to be put onto the shelves. And that requires the planogram. That's the actual term for this. It's called a planogram. And it's basically like a map of what each shelf looks like in each aisle at a given point in time or a period of time. So back a year ago maybe, when the toy company was talking to the sales rep at Target, they were negotiating with that sales rep for placement of their toy on the shelf. And so there are specific parts, like you want to be eye level, or you want to be at an end cap. And so those are really high value locations on the shelves and aisles. And so they will negotiate with the sales team. We will give you this much margin, but we want to have an end cap in exchange, or we want these other considerations. And so there's this negotiating that takes place behind the scenes way in advance. And eventually you end up with this planogram that says what thing is going to be where, in which aisle, and for how long, and it's very specific and complicated. And the Target staff will make it happen. And that takes us finally to the shelf where I got my toy. And that is how it got to me. So, all right, real Christmas miracle here is that all of this was able to happen because we went from raw materials around the world to factories around the world to a single factory that put it all together, and then all of this other infrastructure and logistics and machinery and people, thousands of people were responsible for getting this toy into my hands, and I only paid $10 for it. And somehow, everyone that was involved turned a profit, because if they didn't, they'd be out of business. That's the real Christmas miracle. So thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being part of my family. And I'll take questions.
All right, so I have learned so much, and I'm still just completely, absolutely mind blown that this actually works as well as it does.
Yeah.
It's really amazing.
Yeah.
Also, I interviewed at Target and didn't get a job, but now I know what it looks like, so I don't even need that job. I know exactly what it would have been like.
Yeah, there are so many other ways you could be involved in getting me my toy.
Yeah, so that's for you, Target. No. Anyway, so I have a few questions. So this is, if you don't know this, that's fine. But so the whole idea of the containers needing to be sinkable, was that like a trial and error thing, or did somebody like figure that out ahead of time?
I don't know of any specific story, but
Okay.
the whole container history, so it used to be that longshoremen, like containers didn't exist until like the 1950s. And so longshoremen, their job would be to pack and unpack ships. And it could take like a week to do a single ship. And it was a horrible process. But then with the container invention, it now takes like 8 hours to do 20,000 containers. It's ridiculous. So I don't know, but I also know that there are like hundreds of containers fall off of ships every year. Yeah, it's hundreds.
So you're saying there's treasure.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
No, actually, okay, so this is really cool. So there are stories about people who are using rubber ducks that came from a container that fell off a ship. And they're using those to track currents around the world because these ducks are very specific and really easy to identify, and they travel all over and they float.
That is the coolest. The last question for you is, do you have any tips for just the average consumer about if they can predict supply chain things, or if there are certain types of products that like are more foolproof and others that like, oh, maybe you won't be getting that, you know, in time?
So I would say, I'm not sure if this answers the question entirely, but you can use the fact that these planograms are for a specific period of time to your advantage. Because when a product is basically expiring from the shelf, like they have new plans for that shelf space, then they're going to want to get rid of whatever's in its place. And so that's when things go on clearance, and they try to get rid of them for cheap. I'm not sure why this was 20 bucks, or went for MSRP of 20, and I was able to buy it for 9 because it was only released in late October. And so it was only on the shelf for a month before it was marked down really cheap. I don't know how that happened. Maybe it was only in our market for like a test market, and they're just evaluating whether it's going to do well. I don't know. But kind of went off the rails there. Yeah, wait on stuff. If you don't need it immediately, wait until it goes on sale because it's likely that it will.
Right on. All right, thank you so much, Bob.
You're welcome.